If you burn it now, you will have nothing left. A deep voice called through the smoke, but the young woman never looked back. Evelyn Carter tightened her trembling fingers around the old brass oil lamp, her heart pounding louder than the crackling timber around her. Behind the thin wooden walls of the tiny cabin, flames had already begun climbing across the dry beams her grandfather had carved decades earlier. The familiar scent of aged pine mixed with smoke, damp earth, and the sharp bite of lamp oil until the night itself seemed to breathe with her. Rain had stopped only minutes before, leaving the forest soaked beneath a silver moon, but the cabin remained painfully dry after weeks without a proper storm. One spark was all it needed. Evelyn knew exactly what she was doing. Every board inside that little home held a memory. The worn rocking chair beside the fireplace where her grandmother once stitched blankets through long winters. The crooked shelf where jars of dried herbs still rested beside carefully folded linen. The faded quilt spread across the narrow bed she had repaired more times than she could count. Every nail, every window, every inch of the cabin carried the quiet life she had built after the world decided a rejected Omega deserved nothing more. Yet none of those memories mattered anymore. She lifted the lamp one final time, closed her eyes for a single heartbeat, and whispered almost too softly for anyone to hear, "Please make this worth losing everything." Then she threw it. Glass shattered against the rough wooden floor. Fire surged through the front room in an instant, racing across spilled oil and climbing the walls with frightening speed. Heat rolled outward, forcing everyone standing nearby to shield their faces. Several patrol guards instinctively stepped forward, believing someone had become trapped inside, but the tall man leading them raised one hand without taking his eyes off the burning cabin. Mason Reed, the Alpha King, stood completely still. His dark coat fluttered gently in the cold wind while glowing embers drifted through the air around him like tiny stars. He had crossed nearly 20 miles of mountain forest tracking the disappearance of the one creature he trusted above every warrior in his kingdom. Every report had led him here, to a lonely cabin hidden deep among towering pine trees where no royal patrol normally traveled. Yet nothing in those reports had prepared him for the sight before him. Alone Omega had willingly destroyed the only roof over her head. She did not cry. She did not scream. She simply stood before the growing fire with ash settling across her pale face, watching the flames as though losing everything hurt less than failing to protect whatever still remained hidden beyond them. Around the clearing, frightened horses shifted uneasily. Smoke drifted through the trees, carrying with it the scent of burning cedar and wet moss. Somewhere beneath the roar of collapsing timber came another sound, almost too quiet to notice. A slow, heavy breath echoed from somewhere beyond the firelight. Mason heard it. Evelyn heard it too. Neither of them moved. The Alpha King had no idea who the woman was. Evelyn had no idea the man standing only a few yards away ruled the largest werewolf kingdom in the region. All she knew was that if she looked away from the burning cabin even for 1 second, everything she had sacrificed would become meaningless. Then, just as the roof began to collapse inward, an enormous gray shadow emerged from the darkness behind her instead of from the flames, and for the first time in many years, the Alpha King stood completely frozen. 36 hours earlier, the forest had been so quiet that Evelyn Carter could hear raindrops slipping from one pine branch to another nearly 50 feet away. She preferred mornings like this, when the only sounds came from birds greeting the sunrise and the distant creek flowing behind her little cabin. The cabin itself stood alone at the edge of the Blackwood territory, nearly 6 miles from the nearest village. Most people considered the place too isolated, but to Evelyn it was the last piece of home she had left. Her grandmother had built the first room with her own hands before adding a small kitchen and a narrow sleeping loft over many years. Every loose floorboard, every weathered window frame, and every handmade shelf reminded Evelyn that love could exist even after rejection. She had learned long ago that being a rejected Omega often meant becoming invisible. Villagers rarely invited her into town except to purchase herbs or fresh honey. Pack members walked past without meeting her eyes. Children, however, still smiled whenever she handed them warm bread or wild berries gathered from the hills. Those small moments were enough. She did not dream about castles or royal banquets. She simply wanted a peaceful life where kindness still mattered. That afternoon, she finished hanging bundles of lavender beneath the porch roof before carrying a basket of fresh bread inside. The warm smell filled the cabin, mixing with dried rosemary, cedar wood, and the faint sweetness of beeswax candles resting on the table. She smiled quietly. Her grandmother had always said that a home should smell like someone expected to return. Evelyn still followed that advice, even though no visitor had crossed her doorstep in months. As evening settled across the forest, dark clouds rolled over the mountains and gentle rain began tapping against the roof. Evelyn added another log to the fireplace before settling into the old rocking chair with a torn wool blanket that needed mending before winter. The peaceful rhythm lasted less than an hour. A strange sound drifted through the rain. It was not the howl of a wolf or the cry of an owl. It sounded like a slow, heavy breath followed by the faint scrape of something against the porch steps. Evelyn remained perfectly still. The sound came again. One scrape, one breath, then silence. Instead of reaching for a weapon, she reached for a lantern. She opened the front door only a few inches. Cool air rushed inside, carrying the sharp scent of wet pine needles and soaked earth. At first, she saw nothing except darkness beyond the porch railing. Then two pale silver eyes reflected the lantern light. They did not move. They simply watched her. Evelyn noticed the enormous shape lying beneath the edge of the porch roof, its thick gray fur soaked by rain despite the small shelter above it. One powerful front leg rested awkwardly beneath its body. Around its neck hung the broken remains of a heavy leather collar, scorched along one side and attached to a length of chain dusted with fine silver powder. The animal released another slow breath, but did not growl. Evelyn immediately understood one thing. Whatever had happened to this magnificent creature had not happened by accident, and whoever had placed that chain around its neck might still be searching the forest tonight. The great wolf never crossed the doorway. It remained beneath the edge of the porch roof, watching Evelyn with remarkable patience, as though weighing every movement she made. She lowered the lantern until its warm light rested on the wooden floor instead of shining directly into the animal's eyes. "You decide," she whispered softly. "If you need help, come closer. If you do not trust me, I will wait." The forest answered with nothing but dripping rain. Several long moments passed before the enormous creature shifted its weight. A quiet sound escaped as it carefully lifted its injured front leg for only a second before setting it back onto the damp ground. Evelyn noticed that the chain attached to the damaged collar was far heavier than anything local hunters used. Each thick iron link had been polished smooth, yet traces of fine silver dust still clung to the metal despite the steady rain. Her grandmother had once warned her that silver powder was often scattered along restraints meant for extraordinary animals because ordinary rope could never hold them for long. That memory settled heavily in her mind. She stepped backward into the cabin instead of forward onto the porch. From the kitchen table, she gathered a large clay bowl, filled it with fresh water drawn that morning from the spring, and placed it several feet from the doorway. Beside it, she laid 2 thick slices of warm bread wrapped in clean linen. Then she quietly returned to the rocking chair near the fireplace without speaking another word. The smell of fresh bread drifted through the open doorway, blending with lavender hanging from the ceiling beams and the comforting scent of burning cedar. Evelyn kept her eyes lowered. Wild animals trusted silence more than courage. Minutes later, she heard slow footsteps across the porch. She resisted every urge to look. A gentle splash told her the water bowl had been found. Another quiet sound followed as the bread disappeared from the cloth. Only then did she glance toward the doorway. The wolf remained outside, but its posture had changed. The sharp tension in its shoulders had softened slightly, and its pale silver eyes no longer carried the same warning. As it shifted again, the broken leather collar turned just enough for moonlight to reveal an unfamiliar marking burned into the remaining strap. Half of a black pine tree had been pressed into the leather with remarkable precision, while the other half appeared to have been torn away. Evelyn frowned. She had never seen that symbol before, yet the workmanship was unlike anything crafted by village leather workers. Someone important had commissioned it. Her attention moved back to the chain. Tiny scratches covered several links, as though the animal had struggled for hours before escaping. One end had not been cut cleanly. It had snapped under overwhelming force. Whatever had captured this magnificent creature had underestimated its strength. A cool breeze slipped through the open doorway, carrying a different scent across the clearing. It was faint but unmistakable. Smoke from distant campfires. Leather treated with expensive oil. Horses. More troubling than any of those was the sudden silence surrounding the cabin. Crickets stopped singing. Birds no longer stirred among the branches. Even the breeze seemed to hesitate. Evelyn slowly stood and walked to the edge of the porch. She studied the muddy ground illuminated by moonlight and immediately noticed fresh boot prints crossing the narrow trail leading toward her home. They were too deep for travelers simply passing through. Someone had stopped, turned around, and returned more than once. The wolf noticed them as well. Its ears lifted toward the eastern forest, and its calm breathing became perfectly still. Evelyn followed its gaze into the darkness between the towering pines. She could not see anyone there, but every instinct her grandmother had spent years teaching her whispered the same warning. They had not given up the search. They were already coming back. The first rider appeared just after sunrise, long before the morning mist had lifted from the forest floor. Evelyn had barely finished replacing the water bowl outside when she heard the slow rhythm of horses approaching along the narrow trail. The great wolf had already disappeared beneath the shadows behind her cabin, hidden among thick ferns where the morning light could not reach. Only the faint movement of silver eyes between the leaves revealed that it was still watching everything. Evelyn quietly carried the empty bread cloth inside and closed the cabin door without locking it. A lock would not stop determined visitors, but calmness sometimes revealed more than fear. Within moments, 4 riders emerged from the trees wearing dark traveling cloaks marked with the symbol of the Royal Patrol. Their horses were strong, well-fed, and unusually clean for men who claimed to have spent days searching the wilderness. The rider in front guided his horse forward with practiced confidence before removing his gloves one finger at a time. "Good morning," he said with an easy smile that never reached his eyes. "I am Grant Holloway. We are searching for a dangerous wolf that escaped during transport. We were told someone may have seen it near this part of the forest." Evelyn nodded politely, but answered only after a brief silence. "Many animals pass through these woods." Grant smiled again. "This one is different. It is very large and should not be approached. If you have seen it, we will gladly take it from here." Evelyn studied him while pretending to consider the question. His voice remained pleasant, yet several details refused to fit together. Fresh mud covered the lower edge of his boots, but the tops remained almost spotless. His gloves carried thin streaks of silver dust along the fingertips. One sleeve had a tiny tear, exposing fabric caught on something sharp. More importantly, the leather straps hanging from his saddle matched the color and stitching of the damaged collar resting around the wolf's neck. Her grandmother had always repeated the same lesson whenever strangers visited the cabin. Listen to their words once. Watch their hands twice. Believe what their boots tell you. Evelyn lowered her eyes toward the ground. 4 sets of hoof prints entered the clearing, but only 3 horses carried full travel packs. The 4th saddle held neatly coiled rope, empty shackles, and another heavy chain almost identical to the broken one hidden behind her cabin. If these men truly intended to rescue a beloved animal, why had they brought restraints instead of blankets or supplies for an injured creature? Grant followed her gaze for only a moment before shifting his horse to block the view. "Have you found anything unusual recently?" he asked. Evelyn answered with careful honesty. "The forest has been quieter than usual." His smile faded just enough for her to notice. "Nothing else." She slowly shook her head. "Only rain." One of the men behind Grant glanced toward the side of the cabin where faint paw prints still marked the damp soil. Before he could speak, a cool breeze swept across the clearing, carrying the familiar scent of lavender from the porch and washing away the stronger scent of the hidden wolf. Evelyn silently thanked the changing wind. Grant studied her for another long moment before tipping his head politely. "If you remember anything, report it to the nearest patrol." "Of course," Evelyn replied. The riders turned their horses and disappeared back into the trees, but she did not relax. She remained standing on the porch until the sound of hoofbeats completely vanished. Only then did she notice something else. They had ridden away using the western trail, yet fresh hoofprints continued deeper into the eastern woods. They had divided their search. Someone was still out there, waiting for the wolf to make one careless move. The riders had vanished from sight, but Evelyn refused to believe the danger had passed. She waited another 10 minutes before stepping off the porch, listening carefully to every sound the forest offered. A red squirrel returned to the branches above her cabin. Small birds began singing again from the eastern pines. Yet something still felt wrong. The forest sounded alive, but it did not sound relaxed. She followed the muddy trail left by the horses until it disappeared into a patch of thick ferns less than 100 feet from her cabin. There she knelt beside several fresh hoofprints and noticed something unusual. 3 sets continued west exactly as Grant's group had ridden away, but another set curved quietly through the underbrush toward the creek behind her home. Whoever had taken that path had deliberately avoided the main trail. Evelyn brushed her fingers across the damp soil. The tracks were fresh enough that water had not yet settled into them. Someone had remained behind. She slowly returned toward the cabin, pretending to gather herbs while carefully studying the surrounding trees. Every few yards, she found another clue. A broken fern bent in the wrong direction. Bark scraped from a young maple at shoulder height. A narrow strip of dark cloth caught on a thorn bush. None of these signs alone meant much, but together they painted a clear picture. People were no longer searching. They were surrounding the area. She reached the back of the cabin where the great wolf rested beneath heavy cedar branches. The magnificent animal opened its pale silver eyes as she approached, but made no attempt to stand. Its breathing remained steady, yet the injured front leg trembled whenever it shifted its weight. Evelyn crouched several feet away and quietly examined the ground instead of the wolf itself. Deep paw prints showed that it had tried walking during the night before returning to the same hiding place. The distance between each print grew shorter near the end of the trail, telling her that every step demanded more effort than the last. The wolf was powerful enough to escape restraints, but not strong enough to outrun determined riders across miles of forest. Evelyn looked beyond the cedar trees toward the narrow creek flowing behind the cabin. At first glance, it appeared to offer the safest escape. The shallow water curved gently through the woods before disappearing between large boulders nearly 200 feet away. Anyone unfamiliar with the land would instinctively choose that route. Her grandmother had once shown her why it was dangerous. During spring floods, fallen logs collected beneath the rocks, creating a natural bottleneck where movement slowed and footprints remained visible for days. Evelyn quietly walked to the edge of the creek and immediately spotted something that made her heart sink. Fresh boot prints covered the muddy bank on the opposite side. They faced the water instead of following it. Whoever had crossed earlier had not continued downstream. They had stopped there and waited. She slowly turned in a complete circle, studying the hills surrounding her little home. The western trail held the riders who had openly introduced themselves. The eastern woods hid at least one more watcher. The creek behind the cabin had already been prepared as an obvious escape route. Every direction except one had become part of the same careful trap. Evelyn lifted her eyes toward the weathered floorboards inside the cabin. Beneath them lay an old storage tunnel her grandfather had dug decades ago to protect firewood during harsh winters. Few people even remembered it existed. She suddenly understood that if the great wolf was going to survive, it would never escape by running through the forest. It would have to disappear before anyone realized it had already left. The decision came quietly, almost gently, long before the first flame ever touched the old cabin walls. Evelyn stood in the center of the single room, listening to the familiar creak of the weathered floor beneath her boots. Sunlight slipped through the small windows, filling the cabin with warm golden light that made every memory feel painfully alive. The hand-carved table where her grandmother had taught her to dry herbs. The faded quilt folded neatly beside the fireplace. The rocking chair facing the window where countless peaceful evenings had passed. She slowly turned in a full circle, allowing herself one last look. Then she knelt beside the iron stove and pulled aside a worn woven rug. Hidden beneath it was a square wooden hatch almost invisible against the old floorboards. It took both hands to lift it. Cool air drifted upward from the narrow tunnel below, carrying the earthy smell of damp stone and cedar roots. Her grandfather had dug the passage decades earlier so firewood could stay dry through harsh winters. It stretched nearly 200 feet beneath the hill before opening beside the creek beyond the ring of pine trees. Few people alive even knew it existed. Evelyn picked up a lantern and climbed halfway into the tunnel, to make certain nothing had collapsed over the years. The narrow passage remained solid. She returned to the cabin and quietly approached the great wolf waiting beneath the cedar branches. The magnificent animal watched her carefully as she lowered herself to one knee several feet away. She did not reach toward it. Instead, she turned the lantern toward the open hatch and stepped aside. For several silent moments, nothing happened. Then the wolf slowly stood. Every movement revealed the weight of exhaustion pressing against its powerful frame, yet determination still filled its pale silver eyes. It limped toward the cabin one careful step at a time before stopping beside the hidden opening. Evelyn spread her grandmother's thick wool blanket across the rough wooden floor inside the tunnel so the stone would be softer beneath the injured leg. The wolf looked at her once more, almost as though asking whether she truly understood what she was about to lose. She answered with the faintest smile. "Go," she whispered. The great wolf disappeared into the darkness below. Evelyn waited until the slow sound of careful footsteps faded deeper into the tunnel before closing the hatch again and covering it with the old rug. Outside, the forest remained unnaturally quiet. Somewhere beyond the trees, unseen watchers were still waiting for movement. She walked to the shelf beside the fireplace and picked up the brass oil lamp that had belonged to her grandmother for more than 30 years. Only a small amount of oil remained inside, but it would be enough. Evelyn carried it from room to room, pouring a thin trail across dry floorboards, along the base of the walls, and beside the old curtains hanging near the front windows. Her hands trembled, but her mind remained clear. If strangers searched the cabin after discovering the wolf had vanished, they would find the tunnel within minutes. If smoke, collapsing beams, and confusion held their attention instead, the great wolf might gain the precious time it needed to reach safety. She stepped outside and quietly closed the front door behind her. A cool breeze carried the comforting scent of lavender across the clearing one final time. Evelyn took a slow breath, looked once toward the hidden tunnel beneath her feet, and then raised the brass lamp. She was no longer choosing between a cabin and a stranger. She was choosing between a house that could be rebuilt and a life that could never be replaced. The brass lamp slipped from Evelyn's hand and shattered against the weathered floorboards exactly where the thin trail of oil began. For one quiet heartbeat, nothing happened. Then a narrow ribbon of fire stretched across the old pine planks, climbing the walls with surprising speed until warm orange light spilled through every window of the little cabin. Smoke drifted upward into the gray afternoon sky, carrying the familiar scent of cedar, lavender, and old timber that had sheltered 3 generations of her family. Evelyn did not step backward. She remained standing beside the porch, her eyes fixed on the closed front door, while the hidden tunnel beneath the floor protected the only life that mattered now. Somewhere below her feet, the great wolf continued moving through the narrow passage toward the creek beyond the hill. Every second the fire held attention above ground was another second the animal gained below it. The plan depended entirely upon patience. She could not panic. She could not run. She simply had to wait. Far beyond the clearing, the sound of galloping horses suddenly echoed through the forest. It grew louder with astonishing speed until a line of powerful riders burst through the pine trees, scattering birds into the sky. At their head rode a tall man wearing a dark traveling coat instead of ceremonial clothing. Dust covered his boots, and exhaustion marked his face, yet nothing diminished the quiet authority that surrounded him. Mason Reed had spent nearly 2 days following broken tracks, damaged chains, frightened witnesses, and fading scents across nearly 20 miles of mountain wilderness. Every clue had ended here. He expected to find hunters. He expected to find a struggle. Instead, he found a solitary Omega watching her own cabin disappear behind rising flames without attempting to save a single possession. The patrol behind him slowed instinctively, confused by the impossible scene unfolding before them. One rider reached for a bucket hanging from his saddle, but Mason raised one hand without looking away from the burning cabin. Something about the woman's expression stopped him. She was not staring at the fire. She was listening. Her attention remained focused somewhere beneath the crackling timber, as though the collapsing roof mattered less than something hidden beyond it. The air smelled of smoke and wet earth after the previous night's rain. Glowing embers drifted across the clearing while frightened horses stamped nervously against the ground. Then another sound emerged beneath the roar of burning wood. It was slow, deep, and unmistakable. Heavy footsteps echoed from the opposite side of the hill. Every rider turned at once. A massive gray wolf stepped quietly from between the tall pines with its silver eyes reflecting the firelight. Ash clung lightly to its thick fur, but no flames touched it. The hidden tunnel had carried it safely beyond the cabin before anyone realized it had disappeared. Several patrol horses shifted uneasily, yet the magnificent animal ignored every rider. It walked directly toward Mason before stopping only a few feet away. Relief softened the Alpha King's face for the briefest moment. Then the great wolf calmly turned away from him. It crossed the remaining distance to Evelyn, lowered its enormous head beside her shoulder, and remained there in complete trust. Silence settled across the clearing so completely that even the crackling fire seemed distant. Mason looked from the burning cabin to the ash covering Evelyn's hands, then to the wolf standing peacefully beside her. In that single quiet moment, every scattered clue suddenly fit together. She had not destroyed her home because she had lost hope. She had sacrificed everything she owned to protect someone she believed would never be able to thank her, and for the first time in many years, the Alpha King found himself unable to speak. No one spoke until the last section of the cabin roof settled into a glowing bed of embers. The silence stretched across the clearing, broken only by the gentle crackle of burning wood and the distant rush of the creek beyond the hill. The great wolf remained beside Evelyn as though it had already made its decision about whom it trusted most. Mason Reed slowly stepped forward, his calm blue eyes moving from the ashes on Evelyn's hands to the broken leather collar still hanging loosely around the wolf's neck. Before he could ask a single question, another group of riders emerged from the western trail. Grant Holloway guided his horse into the clearing with a look of carefully measured surprise before quickly replacing it with concern. "Your Majesty," he called, climbing from his saddle. "Thank goodness we found you. We have been searching everywhere for the escaped wolf." His eyes shifted toward Evelyn. "It appears this woman found it first." Evelyn noticed that Grant avoided looking directly at the broken chain around the wolf's neck. Instead, he focused on the burned remains of the cabin. "What happened here?" he asked. "Did she attempt to hide the animal?" Mason did not answer immediately. He simply watched Grant with the same quiet attention Evelyn had noticed in the forest. Grant continued speaking. "Perhaps she panicked after realizing how dangerous such a creature could become. Destroying the cabin may have been an attempt to erase evidence." Evelyn calmly reached into the pocket of her smoke-stained apron and removed 3 objects she had quietly kept since the previous night. The first was the broken section of heavy chain dusted with silver powder. The second was a narrow strip of dark cloth she had collected from the thorn bush near the eastern trail. The third was a small piece of leather torn from the damaged collar, carrying half of the burned royal pine emblem. She placed all 3 items carefully upon a flat stone between herself and Mason. "Your Majesty," she said softly, "the wolf did not arrive wearing only a broken collar. Someone placed that chain on him before he escaped." Mason crouched beside the stone and lifted the torn leather with remarkable care. His expression grew more serious the moment he recognized the royal mark. Only members of his inner patrol had access to equipment bearing that symbol. Evelyn continued without raising her voice. "The men who visited yesterday carried another chain exactly like this one. Their boots were covered with the same silver dust. One rider had a torn sleeve that matched the cloth caught beside the trail. They said they wanted to rescue him, but they brought restraints instead of supplies." Grant laughed politely, though the sound felt strangely empty against the quiet forest. Those observations prove nothing. Travelers often carry chains for many reasons. Before anyone else could respond, the great wolf slowly walked toward the stone. It lowered its nose over the torn strip of cloth before turning away from it without hesitation. Then it stepped toward Grant. The enormous animal stopped only a few feet away, studying him with calm silver eyes before taking one deliberate step backward and returning to stand beside Evelyn again. Mason noticed everything. He noticed the way the wolf avoided Grant. He noticed the fresh silver dust still trapped inside the seams of Grant's gloves. He noticed that the broken chain resting on the stone matched the unused restraint hanging from Grant's saddle almost link for link. The Alpha King finally looked directly at his trusted beta. His voice remained calm, but every rider in the clearing immediately straightened in silence when he spoke. No one leaves this clearing until I learn why my great wolf trusted a stranger more than the men sworn to protect him. The clearing remained silent as Mason Reed examined every detail before him with the same patience that had earned the respect of an entire kingdom. He did not raise his voice. He did not accuse anyone. Instead, he walked slowly toward Grant's horse and rested one hand upon the unused restraint hanging beside the saddle. The polished links matched the broken chain lying on the flat stone so perfectly that no explanation could erase the connection. Grant attempted another calm smile, but it disappeared the moment Mason lifted the restraint and placed it beside the damaged chain. The two pieces fit together with unmistakable precision. Several patrol members exchanged uneasy glances. Mason looked toward Daniel Price, the captain of the Royal Patrol, and spoke with quiet certainty. "Search every saddle and every supply bag." Daniel nodded without hesitation. Within minutes, additional coils of silver-treated rope, written patrol maps marked with unfamiliar routes, and sealed messages hidden beneath travel blankets were carefully placed upon the same flat stone. Mason studied the documents without revealing emotion. The routes avoided villages and patrol stations, leading instead toward isolated forest crossings beyond the kingdom's eastern border. The great wolf slowly approached once more and gently placed one massive paw beside the maps before looking directly at Mason. No growl escaped its throat. No display of anger followed. It simply stood there as though confirming what it had witnessed before escaping. Mason closed his eyes for one brief moment. The truth no longer depended upon suspicion. It rested quietly before everyone present. He turned toward Evelyn, who still stood beside the ashes of the only home she had known. Smoke continued rising behind her, carrying away the last pieces of the life she had built with her grandparents. She had asked for nothing. She had not demanded payment, protection, or recognition. She had simply chosen to save a life she believed belonged to no one she would ever meet. Mason stepped across the blackened ground until only a few feet separated them. "What do you want in return?" he asked. Evelyn looked toward the smoking remains of the cabin before answering. "Nothing for myself." The surrounding riders seemed surprised, but she continued in the same calm voice. "There are abandoned cabins throughout the eastern forest. Rejected omegas, injured travelers, and wounded animals often have nowhere safe to rest. If those places could become shelters instead of forgotten ruins, fewer lives would be lost simply because no one stopped to help." Mason remained silent for several seconds before giving a single respectful nod. "Then, that is where we will begin." He turned to face the gathered patrol members. "From this day forward, the eastern forest will become protected land. Every abandoned cabin within it will be restored as a place of refuge. Evelyn Carter will oversee its care under my authority, and anyone who offers assistance there will receive the protection of the crown." No one objected. Daniel bowed his head first. One by one, every rider followed. The gesture was not offered because Evelyn possessed wealth, noble blood, or influence. It was offered because every person standing there had witnessed the same undeniable truth. She had sacrificed everything while believing no reward would ever come. The great wolf quietly crossed the final few steps and lay beside Evelyn's feet, resting its enormous head against the ground with complete peace. Mason watched the scene with a faint smile that reached his eyes for the first time that day. He understood that trust could never be commanded by a king or purchased with power. It could only be earned through quiet choices made when no one was watching. As the last column of smoke disappeared into the evening sky, workers began clearing the ashes where the old cabin had once stood. In its place, a new beginning would rise, built not upon privilege or destiny, but upon the courage of one overlooked Omega who proved that the strongest hearts often lived in the smallest homes.